This is a 2000 Toyota 4Runner, and it's becoming an icon in the SUV world. The 4Runner is beloved for its capabilities and its durability, and this generation has emerged as especially desirable. Today, I'm going to review this excellent third generation 4Runner and explain why. Before I get started, big news, this 4Runner is currently listed for sale on Cars and Bids, my enthusiast car auction website. And this is an amazing 4Runner. It has only 27,000 miles, four-wheel drive, and a manual transmission. Finding 4Runners from this era in this condition is practically impossible anymore. This one is a unicorn, but it's currently being auctioned on Cars and Bids. And if you're looking for a fantastic third gen 4Runner, this is it. So after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to go to Cars and Bids, where you can bid on this 4Runner, which is offered with no reserve, only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk 4Runner. The 4Runner first came to the United States in the 1980s, but the original 4Runner was basically a Toyota pickup with a cap on the back to make it into an SUV. They only had two doors, so practicality wasn't really a strong suit. The next generation 4Runner came out in 1990, and it was an improvement, but everyone agrees that Toyota got it right with this, the third generation model, which came out here in the States for the 1996 model year. The main reason is an excellent combination of old school simplicity, impressive off-road capabilities, legendary reliability, and relatively modern driving experience. Older 4Runner models were pretty slow, but this one has a V6 with about 180 horsepower and about 220 pound-feet of torque, which meant you could keep up with modern traffic fairly easily, but it still has that old school, boxy, off-roader SUV charm, which makes it cool. Finding one this nice is basically impossible. And today, I'm going to review this 4Runner and show you what it's all about. First, I'll take you on a tour of it and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then, of course, I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the third gen 4Runner. Back here, I want to talk about one very special quirk, and that would be the rear window rolls down. You're inside the car, there's this little button, you push it, and then the window rolls down in back on the tailgate in order to get like a little breeze going inside the interior. It's very nice. A lot of people love this. You can keep your like surfboards hanging out the back. Your dog can go back here and get some air. It's a really neat feature, and I wish that more SUVs had it. Now, the reason I mention it here at the start is it's also on the key fob. You can see there's only 3 buttons on the key fob: lock, unlock, and the one to roll down the rear window. And if you press it, the rear window rolls right down from the key fob. Now you may be wondering, why did they feel that this was so important they had to put it on the key fob? It's not so you could roll down the window and get a little breeze going before you climb inside. Instead, it's so that you can load stuff into the car through the back window. Check this out. You press unlock and then you can open the whole tailgate. But if you have a smaller item, you don't want to open the whole thing, just roll down the window and you can put it inside, and that makes it a lot easier to load small items into the car. It's a neat feature. Now, the one drawback of having the roll down back window is you can't mount the rear wiper on the window itself. So instead, the rear wipers in these third gen 4Runners are sort of hanging out on this little pedestal, and they don't really look that great. But to me, that's a small price to pay for having the really cool roll down back window. Again, I really wish that all other SUVs had it, frankly. And by the way, since I'm back here, one other interesting item on the tailgate, I've always found this rear spoiler to be kind of unusual. Almost all of these third gen 4Runners had a rear spoiler. Not exactly sure why, but it's on there, and there's a little cutout in the center for the third brake light, so people behind you could of course see your third brake light, even with your spoiler in place to keep the downforce happening when you're driving your 4Runner in anger. Anyway, next up we move inside this 4Runner, and the most amazing thing in here is right between the seats, the manual transmission. This 4Runner has a manual. Incredibly hard to find these with a manual transmission. By the late 90s, early 2000s, it was becoming clear that people buying these only wanted automatics. This was the last generation of 4Runner that was available with a manual transmission, and this is one of the incredibly rare, maybe like 5% of these were made with manuals, maybe even less, incredibly uncommon to see. Even rarer to see a manual with four-wheel drive, which this is. You can see the manual lever next to the four-wheel drive lever. That is an impressive combination. And of course, making it even more impressive is the fact that this thing has basically no miles on it. 27,000 miles, manual four-wheel drive. This is a true unicorn 4Runner. You will never find another one quite like this. For a lot of people watching, they'll say it's just a Toyota truck, but for Toyota truck and SUV fans like me, you know how special this is. Finding a 4Runner with miles like this, unbelievable, truly amazing. But anyway, next I want to move on to the quirks and features in this vehicle. There are a surprising amount of them, considering this is a simple, old-school Japanese truck. And I want to start with the garage door opener situation. Okay, you have this little lid on the ceiling. You open it up, and that's where you put your sunglasses, right? Well, yeah, but it has a different purpose as well. You can see there's some Velcro in here, and that's where you're supposed to Velcro your garage door opener. And then when you do that, if you close the lid, you can push on the lid and it will push on your garage door opener inside the lid and it will open your garage door. But it's a little quirkier than that, because these 4Runners were sold new with these little plastic circle pieces. And what you would do with those is you'd install them on the inside of this lid, and you can see their varying heights. So depending on how far your garage door opener was set into this area, that's how much little circle thing you needed to put down on the lid to make sure it could press the garage door opener. I guarantee you there are none of these 4Runners left with these little circle things still around, but this one has them, and that's what you're supposed to do with them. Place them in here so it could adequately push down on your garage door opener. Very interesting little quirk. But next up, moving down from the ceiling, you look at the dashboard and you can see simple is absolutely the theme in here. This car is all about simplicity, ease. All Toyota models from this era were. There's no swoopy lines like modern cars. There's no stuff integrated into other stuff. Like, for example, you had an area for climate controls, and that was where the climate controls went, and they have dials and levers. You have an area for your stereo, and this is the original factory stereo in this vehicle, and that's where the stereo went. You didn't have like the climate controls and the stereo integrated into one screen, and then the climate vents are in some weird shape to make them look cool in this interior. No. Everything was kind of squares, all in their place, stacked on top of each other. Simple was the name of the game with this car. Now, one interesting thing in this center control stack, you have 3 different power ports in here. You have your regular cigarette lighter over to the left on the driver's side, but then you have 2 additional power ports, and you can see the owner of this truck converted one into like a USB port. It's interesting to see 3 front seat power ports on a vehicle from 2000. That's gotten common today, but it was probably pretty forward thinking 20 years ago to have that many power ports up front. You weren't really charging that many devices while you drove back then, but you could if you had a 4Runner. Now, next up, I want to move on to the center console. You open up the center console lid and you can see a little center console storage area in here. Quite small for one of these by modern standards, but it's there. Now, interestingly, there's also a second center console storage area. If you close the lid and then just lift up on the upper part, you will see a tiny, shallow, second hidden center console. The owner of this car told me he's had several of these 4Runners over the years. He didn't know that that center console was there until he read the owner's manual for this 4Runner, and then he was surprised to see it. And next up, also worth noting in this center console area, next to the manual transmission gear lever, I showed you this for a second earlier, this is the lever to shift into 4-wheel drive. And you can see there are several different options. You have H2, that's 2-wheel drive high for like normal driving. You have H4, 4-wheel drive high, and then you have L4 as well. That's 4-wheel drive with low range for if you're like rock crawling or getting through some really tough off-road stuff, you would shift into a low range gear. Now, one interesting thing with this 4Runner, you could shift from H2, 2-wheel drive, to H4, 4-wheel drive at up to 50 miles an hour without getting out of the car, locking the hubs, any of that stuff. You could just shift on the fly at up to 50. That was an impressive feature for 2000. More and more cars were offering shift while you're driving four-wheel drive back then, but being able to do it at up to 50 miles an hour was a pretty cool feature. But then again, this was sort of pitched as an off-roader four-wheel drive alternative to normal regular SUVs. And so having that was a neat feature that a lot of people probably bought this car for. And speaking of four-wheel drive and capabilities, over to the left of the steering wheel, you have a button there marked Clutch Start Cancel. If you press that, it allows you to start your 4Runner without having the clutch pressed in, which can be important if you're off-roading. If you're going up a big hill and you're nervous about rolling back, you can start the car in first and just start creeping forward without potentially pressing the clutch and rolling back down. That's what that button is for. It's a neat feature, and I went on 4Runner forums to figure out what it does while I was researching this video, and a lot of people said, yeah, they've used it on steep inclines and it's actually useful. That's another example of Toyota putting in something for real off-roaders, four-wheel drive people, and another thing that kind of set this apart from more traditional suburb dweller family SUVs back when this was new. Now, next up, an interesting item in the glove box would be the owner's manual. Interesting only because of how small it is. Modern car owner's manuals are so massive. This thing just didn't have that much that needed to be described in an owner's manual, so it's quite small. But just in case even that was too large for you, Toyota also gave you a little pocket owner's manual, which is too large to fit in anyone's pocket, but that's what they called it anyway. And I just love these graphics on the front. They are so perfectly 90s, summing up exactly the era that this car came from with your pocket owner's manual. It's sort of like a quick start guide to figuring out all the most important features in your 4Runner. And next up, we move on to the back seat of the third gen 4Runner, where there are some interesting quirks back here. For one thing, you have a climate control in the back seat, but only heat. You can see the little red slider for heat, none for cold air. You want heat back here? Great. You want air conditioning? Too bad, you don't have it. But you do have this little slider, and you can turn the heat to different levels, high and low, you can see. So there is some semblance of climate control. Now, the interesting thing, though, is the climate control vents back here. For the passenger side rear seat, you have this little climate control vent on the floor underneath the front passenger seat. Makes sense. For the driver's side rear seat, you had this little climate control vent, which was actually integrated into the center console. And frankly, it looks terrible. It looks like a trim piece is missing, but that's the rear seat climate vent. That's how it was made and designed. And it's weird to see these two things asymmetrical back here. You don't have the rear climate control vents in the same spots. They're in different places for different sides. Now, one other cool thing you have back here is the cup holder, which you can see comes out of this little panel marked cup holder in very clear print, so you know what it is. But anyway, you pull it open and you have these nice adjustable cup holders, which actually are pretty useful. You can adjust them to stop in various places in order, of course, to keep your drink from spilling back here. Now, next up, here's another interesting quirk of the back seat. It folds down, of course, for more cargo space in back, but before you fold it down, you were supposed to tuck the seat belts into these little holes in the backrest, these little cutouts in the leather. You stick your seat belts in there, and then that way when the seat folds down, the seat belts won't get in the way of the seat folding flat, which is a pretty nifty little trick. Now, once you've tucked your seat belts in, you're supposed to remove the headrest, of course, to fold down the seat, and then the seat goes down, and then you have these two little holes the back of where the seat went down. Those holes are for the headrest. You can put it back, and that way you don't have to like place it in your garage or in the front seat or lose it potentially. You have a little spot for your headrest to go even when the seat is folded down. That is a nice little practical trick of the third gen 4Runner. But finally, talking about the back seat, I want to talk about rear seat room back here. The front seat is pretty far back, but even still, if it were a little further up, it would be pretty tight back here. I don't have that much space. I do have okay headroom, but not a lot of legroom. The reason for that is this just isn't that big of a vehicle. A new Toyota RAV4 is longer than this Toyota 4Runner from just 20 years ago. The 4Runner has this reputation of being big because it has kind of a trucky off-road vibe to it, so people think it's like this big truck. But the truth is, they weren't really all that big until the most recent generation or two. The third gen was a pretty small vehicle, smaller in size than a mid-sized sedan at the time. It's just not all that huge, frankly. And so rear seat room is adequate, but it's not massive. You can get back here and sit pretty comfortably, but it's not like modern larger SUVs where you have like acres and you can lie down. It just wasn't how the 4Runner was back then. And next up, we move on to the cargo area in the third gen 4Runner, which I would describe as being two things: large and simple. There's really not all that much to this cargo area, but with old school vehicles where you don't have to have as many side impact protections and airbags for third row passengers, you can have a lot of space back here because the walls on the outside of the car are pretty small, and this does have a good amount of space given the size of this vehicle. You can see pretty roomy cargo area. Now, there are some interesting quirks back here. You can see this cargo cover operates just like a normal cargo cover. You pull it, you stick it in place, and then there it is. But when you have it in place, there's a couple inches between the back seat and the cargo cover that are uncovered. So someone could look in, see your valuable stuff in those inches, and steal it. But Toyota will not let that happen. No, no. There are little supplemental cargo covers behind the actual cargo cover that clip into the rear seat headrest. You clip those in, and then you can cover up your full cargo area, so you don't have to worry about anybody seeing anything back here. What a quirky little touch. One other quirky cargo cover related touch on the little clips for the cargo cover. When you stick it in place, you can see Toyota has placed a piece of felt tape on here. This is to make sure that when you have the cargo area pulled out and it's in its little holes, these plastic pieces, it won't rattle around. Now, the owner of this car told me he's had several of these 4Runners, and he's had this felt tape on all of them, so they must have put it on in the factory, a factory felt tape mod to diminish rattles and clicks you hear while you're driving. Pretty nice. And one other interesting cargo area item, there's this little panel over on the passenger side of the cargo area. You can see it has these two little clips. You unclip it, open it up, and then there's just a little hidden storage pocket in there. You have a couple of straps that you can stick something in just in case you don't want it rolling around in the back and you want it clipped into its own safe spot. One other item in here worth noting, you can see there's a power outlet in the cargo area. Now, in 2020, this is really, really, really common, not unusual at all. But back in 2000, this was really an unusual feature, and I suspect they put it back there for an air compressor so you could air up your tires after you go off-roading. You're off-roading, you air down your tires, then you can plug in your compressor to that when you're done so you can air them back up easily. But either way, very unusual and nice to see a power point in the cargo area for a 21-year-old vehicle. And next up, I want to talk styling. As you can see, the third gen 4Runner is pretty simple, pretty boxy, basic, not swoopy or crazy special head-turning design like modern crossovers. Just has a simple old school look, and I think that's one of the reasons why people love these so much. It has sort of that vintage SUV feel to it, even though it's not all that old and has some modern conveniences. It does also look like the Land Cruiser from its era and the Toyota trucks from its era, so it also has sort of that tough Toyota truck vibe to it as well, which looks nice. Now, on the subject of styling, with these third gen 4Runners, worth noting there were two different wheel options. There was a smaller wheel and a bigger wheel. This one has the bigger wheel. Now, if you got the bigger wheel, you also got bigger tires, which meant that they gave you these sort of fender flares that made the car look more aggressive and off-roady. And it also helped really distinguish the bigger wheel 4Runners from the smaller wheel ones, which looked almost tiny and dainty by comparison. Most 4Runners had the bigger wheels like this one, and this is typically how you see them. It's also worth noting that 4Runners equipped with four-wheel drive are about 1.5 inches taller than two-wheel drive models, so you can tell, if you know what you're looking for, a four-wheel drive from a two-wheel drive on the outside. And given some of those changes, it was pretty easy to distinguish a higher-end 4Runner model from a lower-end model. A base model with two-wheel drive and the smaller wheels was easily told apart from a four-wheel drive with the bigger wheels and more options. Very distinctive looks between the two vehicles on the outside without even glancing at the badges on the back that show the trim level. And finally, we move under the hood. You can see the engine under here, the 3.4 liter Toyota V6. Like I mentioned, about 180 horsepower, about 220 pound-feet of torque. Not huge numbers. Even back then, they weren't huge numbers, but they were totally adequate, and frankly, they still are. Now, one interesting thing under here, I love this timing belt replacement sticker that notes the timing belt was replaced at 20,000 miles, which is crazy. Usually you see it at 5 times that figure, but obviously by the date on this sticker, the timing belt was 15 years old, so it had to be replaced, which makes sense. It's just crazy to imagine a 20,000 mile timing belt change, but it was the smart move in this car. Now, as for these 4Runners, it's worth noting the third gen 4Runner was also offered with a 4-cylinder engine, a lot less power in the 4-cylinder. I have never driven one, but I can imagine it is tremendously lethargic. The 6-cylinder wasn't exactly a speed king, and the 4-cylinder must have just been downright slow, but it was available, and it got slightly better gas mileage. But frankly, this is the engine that you want. And so those are the quirks and features of the 3rd generation Toyota 4Runner. Now it's time to get this one out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 3rd gen 4Runner. Before I get started, obviously everybody's gonna wanna know, what is the story with this car? How did it end up with only 20-some thousand miles when they're known for being, you know, high mileage workhorses? The car is actually owned by a friend of mine whose cars I have filmed before. I've shot 2 of his cars before, and he lives in Texas, and he drove it out here so I could film it, which I really appreciate. But he found it in New York, and a dealership, like a Chrysler dealership, was offering it. And he bought it from them, knew how rare it was. He'd had 3 previous 3rd gen 4Runners, and he brought it down to Texas. And he initially had bought it as a daily driver, but decided, you know, too nice, too special, moved it on. He was able to look up the original owner. He found the title or some paperwork with his name on it or something, and he contacted him. The original owner said that he used it very rarely, and when he would go out of town, he would rent a car. He wanted to preserve his 4Runner, and he certainly did. So let's talk driving experience. I have driven a million 3rd gen 4Runners, as basically everyone who is my age has. We've all done it. But I've never driven a manual, and it's a rather interesting experience. It's actually not so bad. I thought it would be kind of trucky and feel difficult to drive. It really doesn't. You get used to it fairly quickly. You do have to put in a little bit more gas in 1st gear than you might expect. It's a bit of a crawler gear, and it kind of feels like a crawler gear, but other than that, it's pretty nice, actually. It feels good. It feels good going into gear. It's pretty, like, sturdy. It's not so bad. And of course, sturdy is a great way to describe the 3rd gen 4Runner in general. Now, a lot of people love the Land Cruiser, of course. It's everybody's favorite special SUV, and I love them too. But they're becoming very, very valuable, and frankly, they're becoming just hard to find in good condition. 4Runners have a lot of the same benefits. Not a V8, but they're also not as big, so you don't really need a V8. But you still have the incredible durability, the longevity, and you routinely see these 3rd gen 4Runners with over 200,000 miles. In fact, it's rare to find one with less than 200. I would consider anything under 150 to be low miles at this point. This thing is 27, which is crazy. But this drives so well, and it's interesting. I mean, when I was a kid, I grew up in Colorado, and these were common cars there. Everybody wanted a snow vehicle, and they were, you know, I remember seeing nice ones back then and being in them then, and they were fine, you know. But I haven't been in one this nice since then, and it's just like a total trip back in time. Like, this is what it was like. Yeah, this was the 90s. I mean, I remember riding in these things and thinking that, yeah, you know, these were family cars back then, normal ones. And now they're sort of reserved for real enthusiasts. I was always a little critical of the powertrain in this vehicle. 3.4 liter V6 with 180 horsepower. It was a workhorse engine, did great. It was in the trucks too. And it did well. I mean, it was a nice, you know, relatively torquey and very reliable engine. That's the real key. But it never had any power. The next gen 4Runner came out and Toyota put a V8 in it. They were responding to complaints that they just didn't have enough power. So there was a much more powerful V6, it was 230 horse, I think, and then there was a V8 with even more power but a lot more torque. And that kind of addressed some of the problems. But you know, for this gen, as I drive this now, looking back with sort of a nostalgia tint in my eyes, it's fine. This is how these things were. You know, I drive my Defender, and I've driven 80 series Land Cruiser recently. These were simpler trucks. You don't really need them to go fast. You can have other vehicles for that. One thing that I am finding interesting driving this is just how sort of vintagey it feels. Because I grew up with these being normal cars, and I don't think of them as like a vintage car, a classic in any way. It's a 4Runner. It's just, you know, people had these were normal cars. But actually, you know, it feels this trucky feel, this upright dashboard, this tall seating position, the manual transmission, you know, manual SUV, that doesn't exist. All that stuff sort of contributes. This does have an old school feel to it that I guess old school has kind of snuck up on me. I didn't really realize that this constituted old school now, but it does. It definitely doesn't feel, you know, all that modern, which is just crazy to think, because I still think of this as a relatively modern vehicle. Now, one interesting thing, you know, this has 4-wheel drive in the manual, but it doesn't have a differential locker. People are gonna go both ways about what's more important. My personal belief is if you want a manual, it's a lot easier to put in a differential locker. You can do that for a few $100, frankly, than it is to swap in a manual. So finding a stick shift, if you want one, is the hard part. Anyway, overall, I've probably gone on too long about a 4Runner, but it's impressive. It's a cool car, and it's clearly having its day. But anyway, it's a cool nostalgia piece and a very capable very excellent, reliable, durable, off-roadable SUV. And so being able to have the nostalgia factor and the longevity factor and the practicality of a family SUV, there's not too many vehicles that offer all that. And I think those are the main reasons why this is becoming so valuable now. It's this great combination of stuff where you can have this cool old school experience, still take your family and not worry about it breaking down. And you can go off-road if you want to. And so that's the third generation Toyota 4Runner. By modern standards, this isn't really all that special. No head-turning styling, no amazing performance, no fantastic technology, but to a lot of people, that's what makes this special. An honest, simple, old-school truck with boxy styling that gets a little cooler every single time a new SUV comes out with a design that deviates from the old-school SUV look that people used to love so much. This is an impressive 4Runner. It's in impressive condition, and remember, it's currently live being auctioned on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this 4Runner a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 4Runner looked nice, but never quite as dramatic or thrilling as the Land Cruiser, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration is relatively slow, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is trucky, no surprise for this vehicle, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is decent. These are capable off-road, which makes them fun, but not exactly thrilling on-road, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Cool factor is higher, as these are getting very cool, especially in this condition. It would be even higher, but these are so durable, they're still relatively common, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 17 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The 4Runner has only the basics, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is as expected for a vehicle like this, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is okay. The materials aren't exactly nice, but it will absolutely last forever, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is good with excellent durability and good interior space, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, value, and this will bring big money. Expect well over $20,000, but it's also a rare chance to buy an almost new third-gen manual four-wheel drive 4Runner, which probably won't ever come up again. Plus, this will probably last for years, if not decades. So I find it to be actually an exceptional value, even at that number, and it gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 30 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 47 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. It doesn't quite beat the 80 series Land Cruiser, which was always a superior vehicle, but the 4Runner is more appealing than the Jeep Cherokee or Ford Bronco from the same era, and frankly, more desirable to me now than a 2006 Range Rover. The Toyota isn't as nice, of course, but at least you can count on the 4Runner working forever.